my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at the race week preview and my final thoughts ahead of the Qatar Grand Prix this coming weekend. As always, if you're enjoying the content or you're new around here, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. So as is the case with all of these videos, it's broken into two parts. The first being chip usage and key considerations and talking points heading into the race weekend. The second part being a revisit of my team selection, which I covered earlier in the week. That video will be at the end of this one, but if you haven't checked it out, please do so. I look at all the different drivers and team builds probably under consideration for this weekend. So going back to the preview, chip usage at a sprint race weekend is always going to drive some discussion, and there are a couple of different ones on the radar this weekend. Limitless and extra DRS boost are probably the two most common and most likely to be used this weekend. The Limitless chip particularly is always going to have the most value, in my opinion, on the sprint race weekend for the most part. We did see earlier in the season the successful use of that chip at Monza by a number of different strategists, and I'll touch on that momentarily, why that works so well. But I think the reason why I would be reluctant to activate it at Losail is because McLaren are anticipated to do well. A number of engaged strategists in the game already have a double or a triple up on McLaren, and obviously Red Bull are going to do quite, or expected to do quite well here. We've already got a lot of those too. So I think the intrinsic value of using the Limitless chip at Qatar is probably much less than when you'd be using it at a race where those more expensive, lower owned assets such as Mercedes and Ferrari to an extent are kind of front and center in those practice sessions. And I guess in terms of practice sessions, another downside, the only other downside, or the only real downside in my opinion, to using the Limitless chip on a sprint weekend is because we only have one practice session worth of data to use and inform our decision making. So don't get me wrong, there have been a lot of previous sprint weekends where the Limitless has been deployed effectively, but probably the most standout use of it so far this season was at Monza, where we saw a lot of people get quite excited about the performance of the Ferraris and the Mercedes drivers through those first three practice sessions. We had enough data through all of those practices to build a team around Max, obviously, with drivers such as Carlos and Charles, Lewis, for instance, that were looking the goods in the practice sessions. Now, I think it's probably best to wait until maybe Circuit of the Americas, the next race, or even into Lagos, where Mercedes typically does quite well, to use it then. I think you can obviously use it here, but there will be much less differential assets to own in your team this weekend. Mercedes are not expected to do that well, and Ferrari may regress just a little bit as well. We'll get into that momentarily. So I think at the moment, the Limitless chip, I'm not going to knock you if you want to use it now, but I think there are a couple of different and better options to use it later in the season. As for the extra DRS boost, I think Max, no-brainer for that, for the 3 times. Another issue I guess I'm finding the later in the season we get, when the competitors are closing the gap to Red Bull, is that there are certainly multiple different race winners we could see getting in and winning a race every week. Lando's had a bunch of second places this season. Carlos obviously had that breakthrough win for Ferrari this year back in Singapore. And then Perez in that Red Bull, although he's struggled lately, is expected to do quite well. I know he's got confidence issues, is not really getting the most out of that car, and he looked well off the pace in qualifying in Suzuka. So I don't think necessarily he's in the best form of his career. If anything, some people would probably argue it's some of the worst form of his career. But if he can rediscover, I guess, what he's known to do, what he's the kind of driver he is, and get the most out of that Red Bull at a circuit that works very much in their favour for the car setup they're running, he could very much put himself in the podium positions on the sprint and on the Sunday. I've obviously got Russell here. I think he's more of just a good consistent option, but Mercedes are expected to struggle a little bit more at this circuit. There's obviously those higher speed corners that they probably won't do quite as well in, and I guess he is generally quite consistent, but isn't having probably as an explosive season, certainly in the more recent races that Norris and Sainz are. So yeah, you just want to be certain when you're choosing your extra DRS boost that the driver you pick as your 2 times multiplier with Max is almost certainly locked in for finishing second, if not third, across the weekend. I've got here on the screen autopilot, and I think you can also make a case for that on the sprint race weekends, but I think this circuit in particular is going to, as I've said, work in favour of the Red Bull. Max should be dominant from start to finish. He only needs a top 6 finish in the sprint to wrap up the Drivers' Championship, and I think he's going to be gunning for that from the outset. So you want to use that in a race where you think there are going to be multiple drivers that have a very good chance of winning, and I just don't see that happening this weekend. There might be opportunities at sprint race weekends, but I think the more I think about it, we saw it used at Singapore on Carlos Sainz by a number of people, and I think there could be, say, a Mexico or even a Las Vegas where we've never raced that before. That's the second last race on the calendar. We might well see a number of different drivers competing for that top step. So I think you can make a case for all three of these chips on the screen. Do I necessarily think they're viable this weekend? Yes, but there are also certain downsides as well that I would just think about before pulling the trigger on any of those chips. As far as the key talking points I want to address in this video, I think the most kind of pertinent topic of discussion around this circuit, Losail, we've only raced at it once before. It has a lot of similar traits to Silverstone and Suzuka. Silverstone, McLaren obviously did quite well there, and again in Suzuka last weekend really worked in their favour too. Their best result of the season, as I've pointed out. Red Bull again expected to be very much in the mix as always too. So I think these guys are going to certainly be, or all should be, within the top 4, top 5 for the most part of the weekend. If I bring something up just quickly now from Formula Stats on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, there are a lot of high-speed corners similar to Japan, as I touched on before. I think that's going to work quite nicely for both of the McLaren and the Red Bull drivers. One slow corner, which McLaren aren't typically that great through. So I think these are, as I mentioned, going to be the template assets to own. Something else just to think about is that the main straight, one just over a kilometre long, I think that's going to work quite nicely for Ferraris, but there are certainly longer straights on the calendar that we're accustomed to that they've also driven quite well at. I know there isn't really much in the way of definitively saying Ferrari are going to do well here, but we've seen over the last kind of 4, 5, 6 or so races, the cars really evolved, the upgrade packages have worked, and I ultimately think that there isn't as much of a concern that needs to be had for Ferrari. Obviously, the tyre degradation as well, documented over the course of the season, hasn't been great, but again, much like the car performance itself, I don't really think it's been quite as prominent as we might have expected over the last few or so races. So I think Carlos Sainz really enters the conversation as a Checo Perez alternative. I'm certainly thinking about him this weekend, and I think he makes for a great case to be had. Certainly if you're stuck in that like budget driver quandary, which I am, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think there's certainly a bit of variation in that kind of Perez-Sainz debate. And if Ferrari look really good in that first and only practice session before the deadline, I wouldn't be surprised if I end up moving for him. So that's obviously great. Just another thing on tyre degradation from Formula Data Analysis. The medium to high downforce setup is going to, in many respects, be quite essential, but as you've pointed out here as well, because of the tyre stress on this particular track, not to mention the track temperatures that are going to be sustained during the day, and I'm conscious that most of the sessions are at night, but there should be still some residual track temperature that will eat into the tyres themselves. It will be quite severe, certainly on cars like Ferrari, like Haas, that are known to kind of eat through their tyres pretty frequently. So not a great look for them. McLaren, I think, as I've pointed out already, are going to do quite well with those kind of medium to high speed corners. But yeah, it's an interesting circuit. I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of car it works, the kind of car that it favours. But I think even with one practice session, hopefully there's enough information for us to guide our decision making heading into the deadline. One last thing I just wanted to point out is there are going to be a few more runoff areas in Qatar. I don't think this particular point necessarily needs to guide your decision making quite as much, but for drivers like Perez and Logan Sargent, who are really struggling at the moment with form, a little bit more kind of leniency with going into those turns might just make them feel a little bit more comfortable, as opposed to putting it in the wall or completely screwing up their qualifying or race session altogether. So I don't think, again, as I said, it's something that needs to be factored in as a primary kind of point of contention. But for someone like Logan Sargent, who can spin out or can kind of clip barriers or whatever it might be, having a little bit of extra space is going to work in his favour. I think one other thing to mention, as I've got in the point above, is that Perez is obviously someone who's really good at managing his tyres. I think he's going to probably want to, if he does qualify quite well, put in a slightly longer stint from the outset, kind of build up that confidence at the front if he's kind of close to that 3 or 4, P3, P4, whatever it might be. A longer run on the tyres hopefully gives him enough of an opportunity to kind of push for the podium places. So that's just kind of my own point of view. I don't know necessarily if that's the strategy at all that Red Bull will employ, but I think the closer he is to the front of the grid, the more confidence that will give him to put in an honest performance. So we will go back to my team for the week. This is where I was post-Suzuka. A pretty disappointing result for Perez and Sargent, two guys that are really struggling for form at the moment. But because of my cost cap limitation, I'm only really given the option of sticking with these two guys if I decide to go the Perez route. Now that Hulk has increased by 0.5, I can't afford him anymore. Or to go for the Carlos Sainz and most likely Yuki Tsunoda route. I could also pivot to someone like Nico Hülkenberg, but I think Tsunoda's got slightly more upside, even though he is prone to the occasional DNF. He had two prior to Japan, which is obviously not a great sign, but I do think he's got a little bit more explosive potential, not in respect of his hot-headedness and temperament, but more just he can drive quite well when he's in a position to capitalise on those overtakes and positions gained. So he could really nicely slot into that position there, but I think they're realistically the only two kind of alternatives. I don't think the Ferrari constructor, a case can quite be made for that over Red Bull, just because Max, I think, is going to perform from start to finish this weekend, and there isn't, in terms of a McLaren constructor, any other constructor at that price point that really offers the same amount of value. Lando and Oscar, I can't really see myself moving off them unless we saw anything drastically different in the only practice session, but I'm not going to try and let that guide my decision making too much, because it is only 60 minutes worth of information, and I do worry that I have been trigger happy in the past when looking at that. So I just want to take all of these things I've already talked about into consideration and make sure that's a more wholesome, fulsome understanding of what my team looks like. But anyway, that's kind of going to be it for now. In terms of team selection, I said before, do check out my team selection video earlier this week. One last thing I'll say before I go is that I am doing a deadline stream with Adam at F1 Fantasy HQ over on FanAmp this Friday, the Fantasy Formula Show. All the links are in the description for FanAmp and their YouTube channel. But I do want to say that we are doing another $50 Fifth Gear Gums merchandise gift card giveaway. And all you have to do to enter is in our FanAmp base on their app. Just put in who you think is going to score more fantasy points out of Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz. It doesn't even need to be right. All you have to do is write the driver you think is going to win, and you immediately go into the draw. The other thing I will say is the winner of that ultimately gets to rename my team for the following race week. So the previous winner renamed my team Verstappen GOAT. I hope Max really puts in a GOAT performance at LaSalle as my 2 times DRS boost. But that you can also do in terms of renaming my team for a week too. So rename it all you want. Hopefully, if you do enter, you can think of something equally as amusing as Verstappen GOAT. But yeah, all the links for that are in the description below. We'll be live at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, New York, 5 p.m. I think British Standard Time. But yeah, thanks again for dropping by, guys. Good luck with your teams this weekend, and I will see you all very soon.